Masechet Pesachim Daf Peh He. We are talking about the prohibition against breaking the bones of the Korban Pesach and the different scenarios. So here we have Itemad, stated machloket by among Amoraim. Ever she'en alav kazait basab makom zeh, v'yesh alav kazait b'makom acher. See, everyone would agree that if there's meat on the whole bone, then for sure you can't break it at any point. If it's bare, just a bare bone, then you could. The question here is that if you have a kazait meat on the bone in its entirety, but in one spot there is no meat, can you break it in that spot? Do we go look at the whole thing, or that just that one spot in particular? He is stringent and says, yes, we do apply. We follow the entire, look at kazait on the entire thing. He says there's no problem to break it in that spot because there's no meat in that spot. We're going to see two questions now on Resh Lakish. Right? How could you be so lenient on this? We have a baraita that says as follows: "Ve'ayesem lo tishberu bo, echad ayesem sheyesh alav kezait basar, ve'echad ayesem she'en alav kezait basar." That's the end of the baraita. It just says whether there is or is not a kezait of meat on the bone. Now, what is it talking about in the second case that there's no kezait? If there's no kezait at all, right, then wouldn't everyone agree it will be okay? Might end kezait basar. Lav kazait basar. Ilim aden alav kazait basar kelal. There's not on the entire bone. There's not a olive size of meat. Amayesh bo mishum shibirat aisim. Then what would be the problem? What is the Baraita talking about? Ella lav hachikamar echad aisim sheyesh alav kazait basar b'makom zeh ve'echad she'en alav kazait b'makom zeh ve'yesh alav kazait b'makom acher. Still, either way, it's prohibited. So since we can't take the baraita just at face value when it says that there's no meat, it must mean it's talking about there's no meat in one spot, but overall there is meat. And yet it says we do apply ayasem lo tishbiru bo. So that's a support for Rabbi Yochanan, a challenge to Resh Lakish. Amar le la hachika amar. No, I don't read the baraita that way. I could interpret it another different way. Echad esem sheyesh alav kezait basar mi bachus. ואחד שאין עליו כזית בשר מבחוץ ויש עליו כזית בשר מבפנים במקום שבירה. I interpret it that either there is a kazait, there is meat outside, or there is an edible food inside, meaning the marrow of the bone. Even if there's no meat on the outside at all, but there is some marrow inside a kazait, then you cannot break it either way. And so that's how I interpret that baraita. So that way, that baraita is not a challenge to me, and I can maintain my opinion that if there's a kazait overall, it doesn't matter where it is, on this side, on that side, inside. One is not. Then one, if there's no, like you said, if there's no problem. If there's no meat on that particular spot, then I can break it. But if there's meat on the inside, there's marrow, kazait marrow inside in that spot, then it would not be allowed. And that's how I apply that baraita. And now Resh Lakish actually turns the table, says, I have a baraita that proves my point. This is a long baraita that goes with a little dialectic back and forth, but it's very interesting. And it'll end up saying the same thing as what Resh Lakish said here, that if there's a kazait of marrow inside the bone, that's also considered meat, and you can't break the bone. That's the immediate conclusion. Whether it has marrow inside or it does not have marrow inside, either way, one may not break the bone. Okay, if so, but another pasuk that says you have to eat the basar. That sounds like you have to eat all the edible parts of the animal, and marrow is edible. So how do we, there's a contradiction. How do we fulfill both of these commandments to eat all the edible parts, including the marrow, yet you cannot break anything, and then you can't get the marrow out? So we say the commandment to eat all the meat applies only to the meat that's outside of the bone and not the marrow. You don't eat the marrow, and therefore you don't break it no matter what. Okay, that's the reading number one. Now we're going to challenge it. This is all part of the Braita. Maybe it's talking about the meat that's inside, and I have to eat that also, right? I have to eat the marrow. And so when it says don't break the bone, that only applies to a bone that has no marrow, right? A thin, empty bone, that's the one I cannot break. But if it has marrow, then I need to break it so that I can get the edible part out, so I can fulfill basar. And don't be all wondrous about this, because the positive commandment to eat all the meat, all the edible parts, can override the prohibition against breaking the bone. So this would be the opposite way of combining these two pesukim that says you can break the bones that have marrow so that you can eat the marrow. So why don't I read it like that? No, I'm not going to read it like that. Here's why. כשהוא אומר, ועשם לא תשברו בו בפסח שני, שאין תמוד לומר שרקבה נאמר ככל חוקת הפסח יעשו אותו. That actually the Torah says twice, do not break a bone. Once regarding Pesach Rishon, and again in Bemidbar 9, Pesach Sheni. And I don't need it to tell me in Pesach Sheni, because Pesach Sheni says you should follow all the laws as you did the first Pesach. So just based on that, ככל חוקת הפסח, I would know that I apply not breaking bones to second Pesach. Why does the Torah come to say again, don't break the bones? This teaches you that all types of bones, whether they have the marrow inside or not, you may not break it. And therefore, the commandment to eat the meat you don't have to eat, there's no way to eat the meat of the marrow. And so this conclusion fits with Resh Lakish's reading of the original Baraita, that the prohibition includes both meat that's on top of the bone and the meat that's inside the bone. Okay, so Resh Lakish managed to answer that question very well, but one more challenge to Resh Lakish's lenient opinion. This is going to be the next Mishnah that we're going to see today. I think this Mishnah is like the link through all the sugiyot. We're going to quote it again, and then we're going to see the Mishnah. So 2 more times. So pay attention to it. It's going to come up. Ebed, you have a limb of the Korban Pesach that left Sheyasad, that part of it left the area where it's supposed to be. That would mean that it left Jerusalem, right? You're not allowed to take the Korban Pesach outside of Jerusalem. Or we're going to see that you can't even take the Korban Pesach outside of the room that you are eating it in, right? Once you bring it into the room from the Bet HaMikdash, it has to stay in that room. So now, if part of a bone was stuck out the window, half the bone went out the window, that is a problem. Whatever part of the meat was outside is prohibited from eating. So now what are you going to do? You want to somehow separate the prohibited meat that was out the window from the permitted meat that remained inside. So here's what you do. You don't just chop it right at that spot because you can't break the bone. So here's what you do. You would cut the meat until you get to the bone, leave the bone intact. Kolef, then you peel away all the meat from the bone until you get to the joint, and then you cut off the limb at the joint. Basically, we want to save the good meat that was inside, but remove the bone from inside the meat. That way, so we're going to peel it all off and then separate the bone at the joint so that we don't have to break it. Okay, that's what the Mishnah says. Now here's the question from the Mishnah. That's Resh Lakish's opinion. Resh Lakish, if you say that a limb that has no meat, does not have a kazait meat in this place, but does have a kazait meat on the other side of the limb, that there's no problem of breaking it, and that would be this case. Why do I need to peel off the whole thing until you get to the joint? Why don't we just, at the point where that was out the window, just peel off a little section right there, and then cut the bone? Because you, Resh Lakish, you say that you are allowed to cut the bone at a spot where there's no meat on that spot. So why do we need to do this whole procedure that the Mishnah says? So that's the challenge to Resh Lakish. We have 2 answers. Abaye Amar, Mishum Peka. The problem is that it's going to crack. If you try to chop the bone in that spot, while you're chopping the bone, you might actually crack it, and it might crack underneath the part of the meat that is permitted, because it's brittle, and it might spread. So therefore, it may come to, even unwittingly, it may come to a prohibition midoraita. That's why we don't do it, but actually it would be a dirabanan. So in other words, Shakish would say, technically I would agree with you, but the Mishnah wants to keep us away from that. Midrabanan. Ravina Amar Bekulit. Ravina says that Mishnah is talking about the thigh bone. The thigh bone has a lot of marrow, has a kezait of marrow just inside it. And so even if there's no meat at all on the thigh bone, you cannot crack open the thigh bone, right? That was a Shakish above who said the prohibition of breaking a bone applies whether there's meat outside or a kezait of meat inside. And so that would be actually deoraita, that you cannot do that. Okay, good. So Resh Lakish solved all those problems, and now we're going to see another Mishnah that's going to relate back to that previous Mishnah. Tenan Hatam, a very interesting Mishnah, comes up at the end, from the end of Masechet Pesachim. Hapigul vehanotad metameim et hayadayim. This is a fascinating halacha. Pigul means the kohen had wrong intention when he was preparing it, right? He said, I'm going to do shechita for this animal, and it's going to be outside of Jerusalem. So then the whole thing becomes invalid. Notad is anything that's left over. So these things obviously are prohibited from eating, and you'd have to burn them, and they're an invalid sacrifice. The Mishnah comes and adds another thing, that they also make one's hands tameh. If anyone touches pigul or notad, their hands become tameh. Now this is not midoraita, right? Pigul and notad, even though they're an invalid sacrifice, they're tahor. Nothing tameh touched them. So whenever you say hands become tameh, that's only midrabanan. Midoraita, either your whole body is tameh or your whole body is tahor. Those are things as just part of your body becoming tameh. But the rabbis created this category as a safeguard to keep people away from various things, like they don't want people touching a Sefer Torah and mishandling it. So they say, if you touch a Sefer Torah, your hands become tameh. All you have to do is do netilat yadayim, or dip them in the mikveh, right? So it's easy to get out of. So why did the rabbis come and say that pigul and notar cause one's hands to be tameh? I mean, they're already pretty serious prohibition. If one eats pigul or notar, karet. Rav Huna v'Rav Chisda. There's two opinions. Chad amar mipnei hashadeh kehuna, v'chad amar mipnei atzele kehuna. One says because of the suspected priests. What would these Kohanim do? If they didn't like someone, they would say, okay, come, I'll do shechita on your animal. And they would purposely have the wrong intention and cause your animal to be pigul and ruin your animal. So I'm sure most priests were very nice people, but some of the Kohanim were vindictive, and they would ruin your sacrifice. So the rabbis came along and they said, listen, if you make it pigul, your hands will become tameh. And so even these unreputable Kohanim would not want their hands to become tameh. They wouldn't mind causing someone a major loss, right, and doing this major sin of pigul, but tum'ah, that's something that they want to keep away from. So this will keep keep them in check. Another opinion says because of the lazy Kohanim. This is talking about like all not only Korban Pesach, but any time. You have to eat the meat within a certain time period. If the Kohanim are lazy, that's a problem, right? Then they're causing notar, which they should not do. So this is a very serious prohibition. But the rabbis came and said, some Kohanim are lazy, and they just don't need it, they don't care. But if we tell them that any leftover will make your hands tameh, then they will be very zealous, right? Because again, they don't care about the serious prohibitions, but they do, for some reason, care about tum'ah, even this low level of tum'ah that only applies to hands. Okay, so that's why they did it. So that's really a fascinating concept. Mor matneh apigul, mor matneh anotar. Now we have these two opinions. Actually, they're not arguing with each other. They're applying it to the two cases, pigul and notar. Which ones? Which manda matneh apigul mishum chashteh kehuna. The one that says because of you're going to have the wrong intention. Well, that applies to the suspected kohanim who are going to purposely have something wrong intention in order to harm the person, the owner that's bringing that korban. And the one that says it applies to notar, the leftover, well, those are the lazy kohanim who aren't going to eat the meat that they're supposed to eat in time. And so to keep them in check, we say their hands will become tameh. All right. Now we also have another machloket about how big is the size of a piece of meat that would acquire this tum'ah, tumat yadayim. Mor matne kezait. One says a kezait. Mor matne kabesa. Mande matne kezait ki isura. The one that says kezait, it was because that's how much you're not allowed to eat. If you eat a kezait of pigul or of notad, then you violate. So that's also the same amount that would become tameh. The other says, kabesa, like all things in the category of tum'ah, something does not impart impurity unless it's at least a kabesa big. So even though we're applying this outside category of tum'ah to prohibitions, we still retain the size for besa. All right, this machlok is going to come up to resolve a couple of problems later on. Okay, so now that we have that groundwork, we have a question. Gazura banan tuma or law. If someone takes a korban outside of where it's supposed to be, if it's korban Pesach or kadashim kalim outside of Jerusalem, if it's other things like a chatat, kadashim, kodshe kadashim, then outside of the Bet HaMikdash itself, right? You cannot remove them. If you do remove them, so then everyone knows that it will become invalid. The question is, did the rabbis also apply hand tum'ah to those cases, right? We know that they applied it to pigul and notar, but what about something that you actually was a valid korban and was taken out of the proper precincts? You can say maybe they made a gezerah regarding the leftover so that you won't be lazy. But to take it outside on purpose, why would anybody do that? That's to be lazy, you just sit around and do nothing, and then it will become leftover. But you'd have to go and actively take something outside of the boundary, and people aren't going to do that. So therefore, you don't have to make a gezerah. Or maybe no, it's the same thing that the rabbis did make a safeguard for both cases. All right, that's the question. It's not mentioned in the Mishnah, so that's what we want to know. Tashema Ebed. This is another Mishnah. Ebed she'asa miksato. The next Mishnah. This is the Mishnah that's in our Perek. That's going to be the next Mishnah that we cited already. So this is talking about a piece of meat, a limb that went out, that was out of the boundary. Okay, that's our case. And what do you do with it? You have to cut it, peel it away, and then remove the bone at the joint. And if you say that the rabbis did say that anything that goes outside of the boundary is tameh, so then that half of the limb that was outside the window becomes tameh. It's touching the rest of the limb, and so the whole limb will become tameh. So what's the point of cutting it and trying to save that meat and separating the bone? The whole thing is going to become tameh and inedible anyway. So we could prove from here that the answer is no. They do not make it tameh. Right? So is that a good answer? Is that a good proof that the answer is no? Tumat setarim hi. Gemara counters. This is concealed impurity. V'tumat setarim la metamiyah, and that does not transfer impurity. In other words, impurity only happens when you can see it. When you see you have one piece of meat touches another piece of meat on the outside, then the tumat transfers. But if it's underneath skin, or another example is, let's say you have a fetus in an animal that dies. Right, it's inside the animal. It doesn't cause tumah to the whole thing because it's inside and it's concealed. So therefore, here the meat that's inside, it's not called that it's touching the other one. It's all concealed, and therefore the tumah does not transfer. So this is not a good proof. Okay, there is another opinion that disagrees with this and says that meat that is connected is the connection between food is not actually a connection, and he considers them separate as such that the impurity will transfer from one to the other. He doesn't consider that concealed. According to him, this seems to be that it would be a good proof that the tumah that the rabbis did not make a gezerah of tumah. Right? It's touching it, so it should cause tumah. We still have another answer according to the opinion that said that the rabbis made a gezerah of tumah for an olive size. Maybe the Mishnah is talking about when it was less than a kezait. So that's why, in general, yes, they would make a gezerah. In this case, it was less than a kezait. Or the one that says kabesa. In this case, it's less than kabesa. So you could still answer and say that maybe the rabbis did make such a gezerah on meat that went outside of its area, but in this case, you want to save the meat by cutting it away because there was less than a kezait or a kabesa of meat. Okay, let's try another proof. Tashema hamosi besar pesach mechabura lachabura. Afa pishu belo taaseh tahor. Another very interesting halacha that let's say, right, I have my group that we have our korban pesach, and you're in another room, even in the same house, and you have your korban pesach there. I am not allowed to take a piece of meat from my korban pesach and move it to the other room where your korban pesach is. Yet, even though I would violate taking it out of its precincts, out of its boundary, and I violate that law, still it's pure, it's tahor. Okay, so you see it's pure. So that sounds like we're not making a gezerah of impurity for taking it outside. My love, tahor ve'asur. So the yoseh mechabura lechabura ke yoseh chutz lemechisato dameh umifsil v'avilu achikatani tahor alma lo gazru rabanan tuma. So we're assuming it sounds like, right, when it says lotas, you violated lotaseh, so this is invalid. The meat that I brought from my room to your room becomes invalid. I violated prohibition, and yet it says it's tahor. So that means that in all other cases where I take the piece of meat outside the boundary, outside the house, outside of Jerusalem, and it becomes unfit, nevertheless, it's tahor. So the rabbis did not make a gezerah. They made the gezerah for notad and pigul, but they didn't make their gezerah for someone who takes it outside of the boundary. All right, that sounds like a good proof. Hey, maybe not. Lo tahor umutar. Maybe when it says tahor, even it said you violated a prohibition, but it's still valid. You can still go ahead and eat it, right? You had it. You got a sin, but it's valid and there and tahor. Because taking it from one group to another is not as bad as taking it outside the house or outside Jerusalem. And it does not cause it to be unfit. So you cannot use this case as a proof to other cases when I took it out of the house or outside Jerusalem. This one is less stringent. And so therefore there's no proof. No, we're going to counter, yes, this is actually a good proof. The rest of the braita, I like when they keep from us the rest of the braita. That way they can, we'll go back and forth and they say, oh, well, now I'll tell you the rest of it, right? If you do that, actually they did tell us. Someone who eats it violates a law ta'aseh. Oh, no, that is sefa. You violate for taking it out, but also you're not allowed to eat it. So you see that it actually is invalid. So you can't say what we said here, that it's valid just a prohibition. So it's invalid and yet it's tahor. So we can explain this and still wouldn't be a solid proof according to the one that says that the rabbis only made a gezerah on a size that's kabesa. Maybe in this case it's only a kezait. So I violated, I'm not allowed to eat it, but it's a kazait. But the reason why it says tahor is because it's less than the kabesa. But according to the other opinion that said the rabbis made the gezerah on hands, even for notad or pigul that's the size of a kazait, so then you couldn't use that answer. So how would you solve it? Ella beyoseh pesach lami ba'yalan delog azura badan tuma my tama b'necha borazizin hen. Okay, according to that, for sure, we'd have to conclude that for regarding korban pesach, the rabbis did not make a gezerah, did not make a gezerah of hand tumah on meat that you took outside of the boundary, because you're eating it with a lot of people and everybody will check each other, right? If you start carrying something else, hey, you're not allowed to do that, right? So we'll make sure to be very careful. אלא כי מבעיילן ביוסי בקדשים, מאי teku. But the question still remains regarding other kodashim, not Korban Pesach, where I might be eating it alone. It might be just a kohen who's eating it without a group, and they won't be other people to check him out. So that question is left unresolved. All right. Now, next scenario. Mosi besar pesach. Oh, no, this halacha that we just said itself, that you can't take from one group to another. What's the source of it? Mosi besar pesach mechabura lechabura. Minayin, right? Where'd you even come up? We were assuming it all along, but what's the source? Titanya lo tosi min habayit min habasar husa. Do not remove the korban pesach from the house, any part of the meat, outside, towards outside. And the elami bayit lebayit mechabura lechabura minayin lo taaseh chutza chutz la'achilato. So it says just from the house, but since it adds the word chutza, right? So that means outside the area, the place where it may be eaten. And since I have to eat it within my group, I can't even take it outside of my group, even if it's within the same house as another group. That's the source. Amar bi ameh hamosi besar pesach mechabura lechabura eno chayav ad sheyaniach. Okay, fascinating. If you do take it out from one group to another, you only violate when you put it down. So as long as you're holding it and you keep walking around, right, you're still okay. Hotza'ah ketiv kashabat, because it uses the word hotza'ah, so it's similar to Shabbat. Ma Shabbat adavat akira v'hanacha, afacha nameh adavat akira v'hanacha. Just like on Shabbat, you only violate carrying on Shabbat if I pick it up, move it, and then put it down, right? Pick it up inside, move it to the Shut Rabim, and then put it down, right? If I pick it up and then I'm walking the whole way, or suddenly bursts into flames and I never put it down, so I do not violate the Deoraita. Same thing with this. If I picked up the Korban Pesach and I moved it to the other room, but then kept walking and brought it all the way back and didn't put it down, then it's okay. Metib Rabbi Ameh Abba Bar Mamal. Okay, there's a challenge to this halacha that you just said, that you only violate the Deoraita if you pick it up and put it down, or you only get a punishment if you pick it up and put it down. We have a question from a Mishnah that says that this is regarding the Korban Chatat that was brought inside the Kodesh Kodashim. This would be like if the Kohen Gadol made a sin, or if the Sanhedrin made a mistake and made a sin, made a wrong ruling. So they bring this is an inner Chatat that's sprinkled inside the Kodesh, and then it's brought outside of the Bet HaMikdash to be burnt. Now, even though it's a Chatat and it becomes Tameh, and when you bring it outside, that's what you have to do, which means the Kohanim carrying it outside will become Tameh. Right, but that's the way it's supposed to be done. So they would carry this as a big animal. So they're carrying it on sticks that they're carrying on their shoulders, with the animal hanging between them. So when they're doing that, when the Kohanim in front walk outside the walls of the Bet HaMikdash, and the other ones are still inside, right, because they're in back. So the ones in the front, their clothing becomes tameh, and the ones in back not, right? This is like the old game when you're driving to on a trip, right? The people in the front seat, they get there, past the border of Vermont before the people in the back seat. So too here. So now the question is, hold on, why should the people in the front become tameh? They didn't put it down, right? They're carrying it, but you just said that you don't violate the prohibition of taking something outside of the boundary until you pick it up, transfer it, and put it down. They didn't put it down yet, so they should not become tameh. So he asked the question, but Rabbi Abba answered it as well. Hu motiv la v'hu mefarek la benigrarin. We're talking about where some of the limbs of the animal are dragging on the ground or right above the ground, and so therefore they are in fact being lifted and put down every second. So they did actually put it down, and that's why the people in front are tameh. And so we maintain that halacha. You have to both pick it up and put it down. All right, and now you already know this Mishnah because we quoted it. We already quoted it twice. Ever sheyasa miksato chotech ad shemagia la'asem vekolef ad shemagia laperek vechotech. So, right, you took the slim, and half of it went outside the doorway, or outside the window, or outside the wall of Jerusalem. So you want to save the meat, right? So you cut down to the bone, you peel it away, and you separate the bone at the joint so that you don't break the bone, and then all the meat that's left there would be fine because all that meat was still inside. That applies to Korban Pesach. Any other sacrifice, you're allowed to break the bone. So just take a cleaver and chop it right at that point that left, and that's there's no problem with that. Because the whole prohibition does not apply. Now, when we talk about taking it out of the doorway, doorways have a thickness, right? Let's say this doorway is 2 feet thick. And so I'm inside and I put it within the doorway. Is that tameh, or is only when it gets out to the other side of the doorway, right? What do we consider the door jamb? Is that like inside or outside? Mishnah says, Min ha'agaf v'lifnim, from the inside, from the doorway and inward is like inward, because is like inside. Min ha'agaf v'lachus kelachus, from the doorway and outside is like outside. Now that's kind of seems like a contradiction, right? What is this talking about? The Gemara is going to ask that and try to figure out what this means. Hachalonot ve'obi hachoma kedifnim, a window and the thickness of a wall, where a window is, a window might be empty space that you put a wooden board in. So all that is like inside. Okay, so for window and other openings, it's clear it goes inside, but doorways is less clear. All right, before we answer that contradiction, here is actually quite a relevant halacha. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav v'chen latefila. So also when you're making a minyan, so you need 10 people to be in a room. What if someone is in the doorway? Does he count as inside or outside? Right, so we're assuming that someone's in the next room, they do not count for a minyan. But how about in the doorway? Is that inside or outside? He says the same halacha. Well, whatever the halacha is, right? We'll have to figure that out, but then we'll know that. All right, this happens a lot. You're getting, 2 more people from minyan and they're standing in the doorway. Rav disagrees with the next opinion. Upiligad Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Tamar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Afilu mechesa shel barzel ena mefseket ben Yisrael avihem shebashamayim. There's a really beautiful phrase that's a kind of a idealistic agadah, but he's applying it to halacha also. It says even barriers of iron will not separate Israel from their Father in heaven, right? So it's no problem. Of course, you can count them for minyan. It sounds like he's going even farther, that even if there's a wall between them, even so, you can count them for a minyan, right? No barrier can separate them. Some people have been trying to quote this source to approve Zoom minyanim, right? If even a barrier of iron, how about wires and electrons, right? So can we overcome even that, and there will not be a barrier between Israel and his Father in heaven? All right, that's questionable, but this could be a relevant source. Hagufa kashya. Okay, so now we know that the same is true for tefillah. We're going to come back. So this is itself as a contradiction in the Mishnah. Amat min hagafa lifnim kilifnim. You said from the doorway to inside, towards inside is like the inside, but then you say the opposite. Hagafa smok. According to that, if you say from the doorway to inside is inside, that means the doorway itself is like outside. From the doorway towards out is not good. That means the doorway itself, that doorway itself is like inside. So what are we going to do about this? I think there's a simple way to explain the Mishnah. Could be talking about the door itself. Let's say this door swings out. So any part under the door would be like outside, right? And any part of the jamb that's beyond that would be like outside. And then any part of the jamb that's from that point to inside could be, in other words, maybe you split the difference. And so wherever the door is, and whichever way it swings, that would be outside and the rest of it would be inside. I think it could just mean that. But the Gemara does not give that answer. It gives a more complex answer that actually brings us to some of the architecture of the Bet HaMikdash. La kashya kan b'sha'arei azara, kan b'sha'arei Yerushalayim. The different openings actually had different halachot, and here's why. when we talk about the Sha'arei Azara, the courtyard of the Bet HaMikdash itself, in that case, the door jamb is like inside. In other words, they have the same holiness as the courtyard itself. But when I talk about the gates of Jerusalem, Jerusalem also has a level of kedusha. The gates of Jerusalem, think of like the Yafo gate, right? When you walk in, there's a big area, right? You can you'd make that turn. That is like outside. Why? Why did the this has to do with when they built it, right? What did they have in mind? Are they going to make this like inside or like outside? When they first built the gates of Jerusalem, they said this is going to be like outside. Will not have the Kiddusha of Yerushalayim when you're in the actual gate. Because anyone who is a Misorah has to leave the city of Jerusalem. They have to go outside. Okay, they can walk around outside if it's nice weather, but if it's raining or if it's too sunny, they want to stand inside the gate for protection. And we want to give them that possibility. So therefore, when they built it, they said the gate does not have the Kiddusha of Jerusalem and the Misorahim can stay there. But regarding most of the other gates, that's not true, right? The gates around of the courtyard are going to have the same Kiddusha as the courtyard itself, except for one. Sha'ar Nikanor, I don't have a picture here, but if you think of the Bet HaMikdash, the Kodesh, right, where you have inside the Kodesh Kodeshim and the Mizbeach, that's all called the Chaser, and has many openings all around. But on the eastern side, that opens up to the Ezrat Nashim, right? The other large courtyard, and that's the main entrance that people would come in and out. So that's called Sha'ar Nikanor because it was donated by a rich guy named Nicanor. That one, the entranceway itself is not holy, right? It's like the outside, which in other words is like Har HaBayit, lower level, like Har HaBayit, second level, not like the courtyard itself, which is higher level. Why they do that? Also because of the Misora'in. When the Misorah wants to become purified, so he waits 7 days, and then at that point is allowed to come onto Har HaBayit. He still can't come into the Kodesh. Yet if a Kohenim is a Misorah, he needs to have his thumbs, big toes, and ears dabbed with blood. How's he going to do that? You see the problem? On the one hand, he didn't bring a sacrifice yet, so he's not allowed to come into the chaser. On the other hand, he can't come into the chaser. You can't take that blood and bring it outside the chaser. So they have to meet somewhere in the middle where they can do this. So that way, the threshold of Sha'ar Nikanor has a lower level of Kedusha. That way they could stand in the threshold, stick their thumb in, get it dabbed, and then they become purified. All right, that's a really fun. That's a really fun picture to see. Sticking their toes in to become purified, and that'll be the last halacha for today. Baruch Adonai Le'olam Amen ve'Amen.